I wonder whether you're a fan of productivity or how to live well, get stuff done, sort of videos and books. I know I find them quite interesting. And today we're going to be looking at a section of Exodus that sort of seeks to provide a pro forma for that. At the end of chapter 19, God promised to make his people a holy nation of priests under him. And in the beginning of chapter 20, we see the start of the guide to how to do that, the way to live. Hi, I'm James, and as we look at Exodus 20 today, we're going to look at what Hemant has to say about the chapter, and just think through some of the comments he makes. Here's Hemant's main point about the first 4 commandments that we find in chapter 20.
We are 4 commandments into this list, and none of them make the world a better place. They are just rules meant to satisfy God's enormous ego. They're useless.
So Hemant, as he said there, thinks the first 4 commandments are disposable. They don't do anything to help the world, but rather just serve to stroke a maniacal God's ego. Well, we're going to go back to the beginning of his video. We're going to have a look at the commandments 1 to 4 to see what he has to say and to explore what the Bible has to say. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery.
It's very interesting that God implies he's super powerful, in part because he rescued the Israelites from slavery. You would think that means God is about to condemn slavery. Nope, that one's not gonna make the top 10 list. Interestingly enough, God never refers to these as the 10 Commandments. We do, but that phrase doesn't come up here at all. Neither do stone tablets. Also, why the prelude here? We know who God is. I don't need a reminder.
As Hemant comments, we get this repeated idea again. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And the question we have to ask is, well, why is it there? In biblical narrative, when something is repeated, it's being stressed, it's being stated again because there's something important about it. And rather than bringing up the issue of slavery and then ignoring it, as Hemant suggests, actually what God is doing here is he is re-clarifying, restating who he is in relation to Israel. This is made clearer by the fact that behind the words in English, the Lord, sit the divine name, the name we would refer to as Yahweh. So what God is saying here is, I am who I am, your God. I am the God of all existence, all of eternity, all creation. And I chose to bring you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He is saying that he is the covenant-keeping God, the God who went out of his way to create relationship with Israel and to bring them into freedom. And so the picture of slavery is contrasted with the coming commandments that look at what it looks like to live as free people, rather than as those who were in bondage in Egypt. Of course, if you want a more in-depth Christian interpretation of the divine name, I'd spent a little bit of time at the beginning of the plagues looking at that, sort of seeing through chapter 3 of Exodus, and I think chapter 7 as well, quite what it meant for Yahweh, the God of Israel, to be I am who I am. I'd encourage you to give that a check if you're interested. Exodus 20 verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me.
God's first commandment is, I rule, and don't you forget it. And all the other Slim Shadys are just imitating. How many other gods were in the running for the role of God? It's a weird commandment. If he's God, then of course he stands alone and no one else will take his place. But if another god turns out to be more impressive, then why shouldn't we follow that one?
Hemant argues that the first commandment is actually almost morally neutral or impractical, that there's no real value to seeing Yahweh, the God of all creation, as the only God and not to have any other gods before him. Part of the reason why this might seem to be the case is because I think that verses 2 and 3 actually go together, because you've got the covenant-keeping I am of all creation, the self-existent one, reminding Israel what he did to bring them out of Egypt and out of slavery, which then paints verse 3 as an appeal not to seek satisfaction and safety and security and anything else anywhere other than in the one God who has proven himself. But what's also going on in verse 3 is that God is saying, don't look to other idols, don't look to other things for your security, because they are empty. They have no capacity or power. Behind that is the reality that surely we must long to make those things that cannot be gods, cannot be real security and safety, into deities. We'll see more of that in verse 4, but we just think of employment or money or love. All of these things we can make into foundations that we rest on, that we ignore crumble quite easily. How much of what we depended on a year and a bit ago for our happiness and our security has come out from under us in the light of COVID? Part of verse 3 is telling us something about our hearts, that we make security and comforts out of those things that cannot bear the weight of that. And what God is saying here in this verse is that only he can. And as such, only security and comfort will be found in him ultimately. And so for a people to be a holy nation under God is to find their security and comfort in him, in the self-existent, immutable one. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments.
I think that commandment was just God admitting he's petty and in desperate need of anger management classes. And also, none of that fits on a tablet. Come on, shorten that to false idols are a no-no and call it a day. And why is this even a rule? If you have a painting of Jesus in your house today, who seriously mistakes it for the real thing? Let's go through this for real though. He just said we can't depict him in any way because he's vengeful and jealous. And so if you make a statue of God so that you have a thing to worship instead of an abstract idea, then somehow God's power diminishes and he's going to take out his anger on your great-grandchildren. But if you love God, he'll reward your bloodline for 1,000 generations? That has logical problems. What if my grandfather loved God, but my father was an atheist? Does God punish me or not? How long does this love last? Because if God is saying he'll reward his most devout followers for 1,000 generations, but he can take that back if someone in, generation 5 breaks the rule, then he wasn't actually keeping his promise with the devout believer now, was he?
In verses 4 to 6 here, we've got the second commandment or word from the Lord. And I think that Hemant makes 3 or 4 points that are worth engaging with here. The first is that in verse 4-ish, God is just petty. I think it would help us to read that verse through and just see quite what it is saying on its own terms. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters below. So as we look at verse 4, it makes sense in and of itself. Do not take anything in creation, in heaven or in the earths, so in the sky or in the earths or in the waters below, and deify them. We shouldn't take a bird from the sky or a star and go, that is something I'm going to praise and worship and trust in. I'm not going to take a brick and make that into something that I ought to rely on. I'm not going to take an octopus or a fish or some sand from the ocean and turn that into something worth relying on, because it's just nonsensical. They don't have anything in and of themselves that make them worthy of that trust, nor even capable of fulfilling that trust. But another sort of thing that we ought not to deify is those things that we were talking about just a moment ago. The job, our money, relationships. These things are all good things, but they can't bear the weight of our absolute dependence upon them. They will crack, they will crumble. And this is less about taking something away from God, diminishing him in some way, and more about trying to recreate him in a lesser format. So Hemant gives the example of the painting of Jesus. Now, I personally don't think that that's something that is the wisest thing to have. I certainly wouldn't recommend, as the Greek Orthodox might do, to venerate these things. But what we're doing there is not taking something physically away from God in trying to recreate something of him in a painting, but rather we're trying to create something new that has a sense of him, but that is never enough. And that sort of heart of that we do with all of those things that we rely on in ways that we shouldn't. If my money is the one thing that gives me security, then my security is only going to last as long as I have enough money in the bank. I might be fortunate enough to stay solvent for my lifetime, but my money stops having value and stops being of use to me when I'm not alive. And if the Bible's claim is true that there is a judgment and God is the judge, then our money becomes completely useless. If we rely on a relationship, we'll strain it to breaking point if we rest on it too heavily. So many relationships break down because we rely on them in ways that are inappropriate, instead of relying on the one who can hold us and sustain us. Hemant also talks about God's jealousy in this section. We can fathom the existence of a good and godly jealousy in a marital relationship where the husband or the wife is cheating. The other partner, the spouse, would be jealous for their partner, wanting them home and back, and such is the situation here. The covenant-keeping God has entered into a relationship with his people, and so for them to rely on other things is the equivalent of a spouse cheating. That is not an evil sort of jealousy. That is a good sort of jealousy. The reason that it rings so evil in our ears is because the sort of jealousy we come across in humanity is so rarely good that it is hard to comprehend anything other. But it's not impossible, and as such, it is unreasonable to interpret that little section there as a flaw of God, absolutely. And finally, we see God's judgment. Now, I completely agree, this is a tough section. It's hard to quite know what God is saying here. He is jealous, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. It is hard to quite understand what this looks like, but what we can take away from this is in verse 6, God is infinitely more longing to show grace and mercy than he is to enact judgment. His justice, his judgment falls to the third or fourth generation of those who hate him, but his love, his grace outpours to 1,000. I don't decry that this is a difficult section to understand, and we don't have the time here to go through it as much as I'd like to and think about it more. If you've got a question about this, I'd love to engage with you more on it and think about it together. But I think at the very least what we can see here is God's love is infinitely more readily available than his judgment when we're living in the way that he would have us live.
Commandment 3, don't take God's name in vain. But shouldn't God care more about what's in your heart than what comes out of your mouth, especially in a heated moment? How many ways are there really to misuse God's name anyway? I mean, even if you're cursing God, you're technically using his name properly, grammatically speaking. Misusing God's name would really be like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat this God. I mean, and no one does that, so this commandment isn't even useful. Forget the devil. Grammar is God's worst enemy.
So Hemant jokes that it's grammatically rather difficult to misuse God's name. To eat God would be a misuse at a grammatical level. But in doing so, he also points to, I think, what is a more profound and significant point, which is, why isn't God more concerned with our hearts than what we say in our mouths? Well, Jesus in the New Testament says in Luke that it is out of the abundance of what our hearts are full of that our mouths speak. Now, he's obviously not being medical there. He's not talking about blood. He's being metaphorical. He's saying that the things that drive our passions, the things that we love most, affect what we say. And so Hemant is quite right in saying that God should be more concerned with our hearts, but I'd argue that he is. What God is saying there is not, make sure you utilize my name in the right way in sentences, but more so saying, you should have hearts that love me and long for me. This is consistent with the first couple of commandments. God is concerned that we find our treasure, we find our security and our safety and our hope in the right places, as we recognize and we relate to God in the right way. This commandment is about having the right heart attitude to God, that we should love him. And we know that this is consistent with how human relationships work. If I were to visit my mother and go to dinner and spend time with her, but not really care about her, then it's not really a relationship, is it? It's not a good one at the very least. And so the same is true here with God. What he's saying is, find your treasure, find your value, find your security in me. And part of that is loving me, recognizing who I am and treasuring me as I should be treasured. Next, we're going to look at the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
The justification here makes no sense. God is saying, I created the world in 6 days and then rested, so you have to as well. But he's God. He has magical powers. He can afford to rest. Some of us need to work on weekends to make ends meet. And you know what? If we're supposed to imitate God here, he should sweeten the deal. Why doesn't God work one day and take 6 off? He could do it if he's all powerful. It's kind of dumb that God has all these powers, but still needs 6 days to get his work done. Speaking of which, why do we have to work 6 days? Screw that. These Israelites need to form a union so they can get a 2-day weekend. And what does God want us to do on the Sabbath day? Sit around? I mean, we're going to need something to eat, so someone's got to work. Either you or whoever's preparing the takeout order. Hell, for many pastors, their busiest day is a Sunday. How's that for irony? Even reading the Bible is a kind of work for your eyes. So really, you should all be atheists on the Sabbath. That's the only way to truly honor God's wishes.
Hemant's main point about the fourth commandment is that the justification for the Sabbath doesn't make sense. God appeals to creation order, to the 6 days that he took to create, and the 1 day of rest to justify why the Sabbath ought to occur. And this seems consistent with what's come before, because the creation order functions as an illustration of God's primacy in our lives. You see, we work for him for 6 days, and that is a good thing. Work was a good thing in the creation before the fall. Adam and Eve were commissioned to look after the garden. And so we work 6 days for the Lord, and then on the seventh day we rest. We come back to him for sustenance, for rest, for comfort, for security. That is the way in which the people of God are to be equipped and enabled to live each week, each day. Hemant makes a couple of jokes, and I don't want to take punchlines too seriously, but if there are some serious questions behind them, I want to offer answers. Why not a 2-day weekend, Hemant proposes, when I would argue there that God has told us that work is a good thing. and that if we're longing for a second day in our weekend, we're longing more for our own sort of rest that we find in other things than in God. So in this light, this command to hold the Sabbath is a command to orientate the whole of life, the way we expend our energy and our time, around the God who equips and enables and sustains us. We're going to now return to where we began, to Hemant's conclusion of the first 4 commandments.
We are 4 commandments into this list, and none of them make the world a better place. They are just rules meant to satisfy God's enormous ego. They're useless. Anyone who says we need to install 10 Commandments monuments outside schools or courthouses probably can't recite these first 4.
So Hemant's 2 sort of concluding thoughts about the first 4 commandments are that they don't make the world a better place, and they're designed only to serve a maniacal deity's ego. I think we've dealt with this claim of ego as we've looked at the reality of a God who does indeed create and sustain all things in himself, and the question of his jealousy, a right jealousy for those people who he is covenanted with, going off and seeking other things to sustain them that ultimately cannot. But do these first 4 commandments really not make the world a better place? Well, I'd like to argue that they do make the world a better place. I believe the Bible is true. I believe that God has given us the words we're looking at today, and I believe that everything that he has said is crucial in some way. If that's the case, then these things are all important. And I think that's really clearly seen in the New Testament, where Jesus summarizes the 10 commandments for some teachers of the law. Matthew 22 is a good example, but there are a lot of places where he does this throughout the Gospels, where he summarizes the great commandments, the 2 great commandments. The first is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And the second is, love your neighbour as yourself. You see, as you read through the 10 commandments we have in Exodus chapter 20, how Jesus has summarized the first 4 and then the latter 6 in these 2 great statements that are the heart of what's going on here. And for a moment, I'd like us to just look at the second. The commandments we've not looked at are summarized as love your neighbour as yourself. So what God is calling for us is a radical sort of care for those around us that looks like the way that we care for ourselves. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that I can be pretty self-centered. I can be pretty concerned with my own self at times. And just imagine what sort of radical love it would look like if we were as concerned, as burdened, as bothered for the people around us as we tend to be for our own comfort and safety and happiness. It would look like a real radical sort of care and an unbelievably deep sort of concern for the people around us. And I don't just mean sort of the platitudes we share with the postman or the slight happiness we have around the guy across the road who likes the same sports team as us. But the parable of the Good Samaritan gives us a sense of this really radical sort of love. 2 people who know nothing of one another, one who is in dire need, and the other who gives at great expense just because he feels the burden of loving his neighbour, someone close to him, as himself. Now, I think that this is a radical call, but I don't think this is a human philosophy. I don't think this is something we can just pluck out of thin air on our own. I think this is ultimately divine. We see nothing of it elsewhere. And it is fueled by the essential relationship with God. This sort of radical concern at our own cost for those around us, for anybody around us, is reliant upon a relationship with God, a love for him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, with our very being. So as we return to the commandments, we see that these first 4 fuel the rest. That we cannot do as we ought to do if we do not love God right. We cannot be a holy people if we do not love God the way we ought to. This is a radical call, a radical challenge to be more than we are capable of on our own. And the testimony of the whole of the Bible is that all of humanity fails to live up to these things. We all fall short. But wonderfully, the truth of the gospel is that in God, in Christ, Jesus' life, death and resurrection, the requirements of the law were perfectly fulfilled, perfectly achieved, so that we could enter into a new relationship with God, renewed by Jesus' sacrifice, in the same way as we are called in Exodus 20 to rely on God for all things. The gospel is telling us that Jesus is the one in whom we should rely on for salvation that leads us back into relationship with God. I think this is entirely consistent with the God who wants to have a relationship with Israel in the moment that Exodus is writing about here, and equipping them to live for him. These verses in chapter 20 are the beginning of God's declaration of what it looks like to be his holy people, which we'll continue to explore over the coming chapters. I hope you found something interesting and helpful here. I appreciate that we've not had a long time to look at all of these things, but that this video is already relatively long, so I'm sorry, but thank you if you've kept up and you've continued watching. If there's any questions that I didn't cover that you'd like me to, or that you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, do please drop them in the comments or send me a message. Do like this video if you found it helpful. It helps me know that people are finding these things helpful. And do subscribe if you'd like to see the next one. I look forward to having a look at Exodus chapter 21 next week.